This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Iowa, private cosmetology schools are reaping big profits at the expense of their students. That's the takeaway from Tangled Up in Debt, a new investigation by reporters Meredith Kolodner and Sarah Butrymowicz of the Hechinger Report. They join us today. Sarah, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
And Meredith, welcome to you as well.
Thanks so much.
Meredith, I want to start with you. Why Iowa?
There were a few reasons why we chose Iowa. One of the largest ones was that the level of debt that the students in Iowa were graduating with, compared with the salaries they were making, was very, very large. And so we wanted to take a look and see what it was that was going on in that state that was causing such a large disparity and such financial hardship for the students who were graduating from the cosmetology schools.
And you decided to focus on one particular network of schools, that's Le James International College. Tell us a little bit about them.
We did focus to some extent on Le James because they had some of the worst outcomes for students in the state. But they also had some litigation that had been settled with the Attorney General, and so we were able to see much more about how that school worked. But I have to say, it wasn't necessarily so off the mark in terms of other students and their outcomes. That is to say that there were other students graduating from other schools in the state that also were putting their students in pretty tough financial situations upon graduation.
Sarah, you took the lead on that data analysis and digging up some of those court records. Where was the first place you went?
We started with good old college scorecard data, which has debt levels for students, has earnings data. And we worked with that and a few other federal sources of data to try to get a picture for what the outcomes are for cosmetology students across the country. Like Meredith said, Iowa had some particularly high debt loads, but we found it to be an issue in most states.
This is a story that's definitely heavy on the data. You crunch the numbers, but there's also a lot of real live people whose lives have been affected by this. One of them is Tracy Lozano. Meredith, how did you find her?
I found Tracy by walking into a salon, and it was a great clip salon in Des Moines, and speaking with people. That's how we found a lot of the people that we talked to in the story. But Tracy stood out as somebody who was willing to speak with me about all manners of what had happened to her in terms of her career. She really had decided to become a cosmetologist because she wanted to do something meaningful after she graduated from high school, and she felt like cosmetology would be a way of kind of making people feel good about themselves and something that she would be able to do. She could graduate within a year and start working right away.
I think what's really heartfelt about this story is these are people who were trying to do everything that they've been told to do, which is to improve themselves, to better themselves through education. And really, they're coming out on the other side, and it's really not much better for them.
One thing that was hard about hearing people say to us things like, well, the students who worked hard and made wise financial decisions are able to do well, and those who are suffering are the ones who either didn't do what they were told or in some way made mistakes along the way. And speaking with Tracy, it was just such an opposite picture. I mean, she had done everything that you could imagine, and certainly more than I could imagine myself being able to do, going to school and to work with a 4-month-old baby. So she would go to school from 9 to 5 and then go work at Pizza Hut and then come home. And her mom was taking care of her kids, so she didn't have as much childcare costs. She was living at home. She worked all through school. And then after she graduated, and she still ended up thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, even though she got a job right out of school as well. It was just distressing to both see how hard she had to work and how much she was still in debt, and then to have people talk about people like her as if they just must not be trying hard enough.
Let's talk a little bit about the business model for these beauty schools. How are they making a profit besides on tuition?
The business model that these schools rely on, at least according to some people that we talk to who know about their financials, the way it works is you spend some time in the classroom kind of learning the theory of things, and then at a certain point you're transferred to the floor and you basically are an employee then of this school salon. We talked to some students who went to schools where they really felt like this time was used very well. Unfortunately, we talked to many more students who did not feel that way, who would spend time kind of just sitting around trying to clock the number of hours they had to clock. The practice of having students work for free in these salons is done across the country. It's rare in terms of education, but it's very common in cosmetology education.
And the school model is just one piece of this. Obviously, the other part we want to talk about is the state licensing requirements in terms of the practical experience you're supposed to get before you can go out and do the job. And there's a quote in the story, it just stunned me. I'll just read it right out. An Iowa cosmetologist who has a heart attack can have her life saved by a medic with 1/16 of her training. Meredith, explain that.
So in order to get your cosmetology license in Iowa, you need to clock 2,100 hours, which is basically the equivalent of going to school for more than a year, 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, roughly. To become an EMT in Iowa, you only need to do 132 hours, and you can do that within about 4 to 6 weeks at a community college. So not only is the training much less extensive, even though you're charged with potentially saving someone's life, but also the time and then the debt that you go into is also much, much higher for cosmetology. And a lot of times, as an EMT, you can potentially make more than a cosmetologist. So the requirements struck a lot of people we talked to as somewhat curious.
And certainly people were paying attention to this. It's not necessarily a huge surprise to people in the industry, but there's been significant pushback to scaling back those requirements. Where's that pushback come from?
Well, in Iowa, the pushback was coming from the Iowa Schools Association, which is made up of the for-profit schools in the state. Iowa is not completely alone, although they are much more extreme in the fact that they don't really have any short-term programs run by community colleges that are generally more affordable for students. So the schools there formed a political action committee. They donate to candidates, and they lobby very hard in the state legislature. Last year, they lobbied to keep the hours at 2,100 hours instead of bringing it down to 1,500, and they were successful.
We're talking with Sarah Butrymowicz and Meredith Kolodner of the Hechinger Report about their investigation, Tangled Up in Debt. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you for taking a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback is helping us grow. Meredith, we know there are often more affordable options for these kinds of cosmetology programs. Community colleges usually charge a fraction of the cost of these private schools. What's keeping students like Tracy from getting to those programs?
Well, one of the problems in Iowa specifically is that there's only one community college in the entire state that offers the program that would allow you to sit for an exam so you could get your license to practice cosmetology. And it's located in a fairly remote part of the state. So it's very difficult to get there and to go to classes there if you don't live in that particular town. And one of the things to note is that the lack of that option is going to have a big impact on students. The average cost of the for-profit schools, cosmetology schools in Iowa, the cost of attendance is $20,000, whereas the average cost to get your associates in Iowa is more around $5,000. So that's a big difference in terms of what you're going to pay.
Sarah, you mentioned the college scorecard, which is one way for potential consumers to look at the quality of a program they may be thinking of going to. But who's holding these kinds of cosmetology schools accountable?
With the cosmetology schools, you'll find a lot of the same oversight questions that you get with other for-profit schools. They are accredited. There's a national accrediting agency that specializes in accrediting cosmetology schools, and there are some other national accreditors that might oversee these programs. But as other folks have documented, national accreditors sometimes have weak oversight. Their standards aren't necessarily very high. So to meet these benchmarks is not too onerous on the schools. Also, the federal government under Obama started to do these gainful employment statistics that looked at the ratio of debt students were leaving a given program with and the amount they were earning, and kind of had a threshold for if you are not making enough money to comfortably pay back your loans, your program isn't serving you well. And there could be negative consequences for those programs if that happened repeatedly. There's been a lot of buzz about gainful employment regulations since Betsy DeVos took over as Secretary of Education, and a lot of concern that she is trying to weaken those. That's something that the National Cosmetology School Association has fought for. They think those measurements are not fair to their graduates. And it looks like they might be successful in helping to kind of roll that back and reduce that level of accountability.
And Sarah, you also looked at legislation that's happening in other states. What are you seeing in terms of patterns and trends?
There have been several bills introduced across the country in the last 5 years or so to attempt to reduce the number of hours required to be a cosmetologist. So again, that is something that is set at the state level. We've heard that a lot of these hours were set, decades ago, and kind of no one remembers why now. And it's being put under the microscope because of a few driving forces, including libertarians who just want to reduce regulations and big salon chains who are having trouble finding workers. So I believe it's at least 11 states across the country, there have been these bills introduced to lower the amount of hours required for a cosmetology license. Overall, they're mostly successful. But in some of the bigger states in Texas and Ohio, the schools were very successful in banding together and preventing these bills from moving forward.
Is there a state that's doing it right?
So one of the things that we found out about near the end of our reporting that we didn't get a chance to look into too deeply, but really intrigued me as a concept, was Oregon has now a competency-based way of getting a cosmetology certificate. So that state, if you were to add up all of the different trainings that they require to do hair, nails, and aesthetics, it's 2,300 hours, which would be the most in the country. But there's a couple key differences. One, you can just go for hair and go for fewer hours, which is not an option in other states. The other is they now have this competency-based program where you can go to school, and once you prove that you can do all the things you need to do, that you can, safely sanitize your workplace and you can mix chemicals to dye hair, once you prove that you can do those, you can graduate. So we talked to schools that said several students will leave in half the amount of time required because they get it and they can prove that they get it. So that was really intriguing. I'm not sure we know enough about it to say it's right, but it seemed like a really interesting concept for approaching this kind of education.
Yeah, and just to add to that, some of the women we spoke to, not all of them, but a lot of them had been doing hair and nails for many years, and they were taught by their moms. And so to have a program that you could go and just show that you are able to do all the different jobs and tasks would have been a major benefit to them because they had already learned a lot of the basics. There's also some states like in New York where they actually have vocational high schools that students can go to. Of course, that would mean that you would have to be quite young when you decided you wanted to do that. But you get trained in high school, it is free, and you graduate with the credentials that you need in order to get a certificate and then also take the licensing exam.
Meredith, did anything surprise you in your reporting?
I guess in part, I was surprised in Iowa by how many people, certainly at the legislative level, didn't really have much of an objection to bringing down the hours to 1,500, and yet nobody seemed to be able to do it. I kept waiting to find somebody who had the power at the policy level to make the change, who would say, no, that's not a good idea, but we never found that. And so that level of inertia, or perhaps the power of the For-Profit Schools Association, was fairly stark compared with the women themselves who were being affected, who didn't seem to have a mechanism to make their voices heard, whether they were for or against bringing down the hours. That level of organization wasn't there. I also was surprised from walking into the salons how universal the experience was, not the opinions or necessarily the life circumstances, but how many people both went into the profession because they really wanted to, and they really wanted to do something meaningful, and were saddled with debt. It was very pervasive from talking with people.
Sarah, what's a story idea for a local reporter who may want to springboard off your reporting?
I think there's a lot of room in here. As much as we put into this story, in some ways we only scratch the surface. I would encourage reporters to look at regulations that exist in their state, not just for the number of hours that are required to get a cosmetology certificate, but also to look at, nail technician and barber and some of these other things that fall under the same umbrella. Look at whether or not someone is allowed to braid hair without a cosmetology certificate in your state. That's been a fight in a number of states, including Iowa, in recent years. So there are a lot of pieces of this and a lot of ways for the schools, if they are able to exercise their influence, to do so. And so I would encourage people to look at lots of the regulations and see, are there other ways in which you can see the people who would profit off of keeping these students in school are able to get their way.
Meredith, do you have a story idea?
Well, one of the things I guess I would do is to walk into some of the salons nearby, either near where you live or near where you work, because some of the things that we learned were directly from the people we spoke to. We were able to back that up by, going to court records and data and legislative bodies and legislation and whatever else. But some of the best leads and best ideas we got about what was going on were from people who we talked to, whether it was via Facebook or from going into the salons themselves. So that might be a place to start, because there might be issues at the local level that is harder to find online or in documents, but the people themselves, the cosmetologists themselves, may give you a hint as to what the issues are, or if there's a particular school that's been causing problems for people.
I would talk to the local community colleges and find out who's got the longest waiting lists. What are the most popular programs? Because that might give you an idea of some of the volume of students who may be looking for those private options.
Absolutely. If there are for-profit schools that are nearby community colleges that offer those programs, you can ask questions about how that for-profit school is staying in business, even though it requires a much higher tuition payment. One of the things that we found that I don't think we spoke about yet is a lawsuit that was filed by the James International Beauty School and the Schools Association in Iowa that actually blocked a community college's proposal to open a cosmetology program there. They ended up settling, coming out of the litigation, but it might be worth looking up court records if you don't have any local or community college programs to see if there's possibly a reason why.
I think both can be interesting options where a community college program is overflowing and the for-profit school may take advantage of that. But also what we saw in Iowa is not that there was too great a need. The community colleges couldn't fill it. We kind of saw that these schools were coming in and filling this vacuum and then maintaining the vacuum, basically.
Sarah Butrymowicz is a senior editor for investigations, and Meredith Kolodner is a staff writer. They both joined us from the Hechinger Report. Thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
This was great. Thanks for being interested in our story.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.